In 1864, Colorado, where I come from, stood at the crossroads of manifest destiny. The exact point at which America's dreams of westward expansion crashed into the reality of Native Americans who bore no willingness to surrender their lands or way of life. For several years, Colorado's Native peoples and its newly arrived immigrants from the East have been locked in a violent struggle over the territory's fate. Tribes such as the Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others were regularly attacking those moving into the state from the East, and those newly arrived immigrants at times welcomed and even begged for the wholesale slaughter of all Indians. All of this could have changed one September day in 1864 when a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders arrived in Denver seeking peace. They wanted an end to the conflict. However, their overtures were rebuffed. Leaders in Denver decided that the only way to rid the state of its native peoples was through war. As the territorial governor said at the time of this peace conference, "What shall I do with the 3rd Colorado Regiment if I make peace? They've been raised to kill Indians and they must kill Indians." You see, just months before this peace conference, the territorial governor, John Evans, had asked the U.S. Army's 3rd Regiment to come and rid the state of its native peoples. After the failed peace conference, the Cheyenne and Arapaho went out to the eastern plains, and they surrendered most of their weapons at a place called Fort Lyon. And they were encouraged to find a quiet place to settle over the winter. So they went up north and found an old village site along a place that we now know as Sand Creek. Meanwhile, the 3rd Regiment of Volunteers gathered forces from other Army regiments, and they headed towards the settlement. They knew exactly where the Cheyenne and Arapaho would be, and they knew that they would be easy targets. And so they headed to this encampment and readied for war. On the bitter cold morning of November 29, 1864, nearly 700 soldiers of the U.S. Army arrived at the encampment. The leader of the Cheyenne, Black Kettle, raised an American flag and a white flag beneath it as a sign of surrender. And as the Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders walked towards the Army officers, the Army opened fire, and they began killing everyone they could: men, women, children, the elderly, everyone. By the next morning, upwards of 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho lay dead. But their murder was not enough. Over the next 24 hours, the U.S. Army rampaged through the village, collecting clothing, weapons, everything they could, including even body parts: ears, genitalia, fingers, and scalps. Several weeks later, the 3rd Regiment arrived back in Denver. There was a parade for the 3rd Regiment that literally snaked all the way through the entire town then of Denver. For the Christmas annual show in Denver's theater, 100 scalps of the Cheyenne and Arapaho were strung across the stage. Additionally, many of the body parts and other trophies from the massacre were presented in the homes of the Army's officers. There, these body parts would eventually make their way into other collections and eventually museums, where they would sit for decades waiting for their repatriation. The word repatriation comes from the Latin repatriatum, meaning to go back home, to go back to one's homeland. And in recent decades, repatriation has become a global controversy as indigenous peoples and source nations around the world have sought to reclaim their culture and heritage from museums. Many of these debates might be familiar to you, if not always that well understood. So, For example, perhaps you've heard of the so-called Elgin marbles or Parthenon marbles that are held in the British Museum, and they came from Greece, and Greece has been asking for these back for many decades. Perhaps you've heard of how Egypt has been claiming back antiquities from around the world, most famously this beautiful 3,000-year-old bust of Queen Nefertiti. Not long ago, Yale University returned treasures that it held from Machu Picchu in Peru. But all of these debates and controversies really pale in comparison to what we're dealing with right here in the United States, where just about every single tribe, 573 tribes today, are being impacted by the removal of their ancestors and their belongings to museums all across the country and even the world. In 2007, I was hired as a curator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And perhaps like some of you, I'd heard about repatriation, I'd studied a bit about it in school, but I'd never actually done it. And when I arrived at the museum, I was put in charge of the museum's repatriation program. And as I started to do that work, I saw that what I'd kind of just heard about, what I'd seen as newspaper headlines, really didn't fit the complexity of the work of repatriation. What I saw by actually doing the work of repatriation was that it's a subject that intersects history and politics, law and morality, science and spirituality. And so I set out to write a book that would help explain how repatriation works. I wanted to answer questions such as how has repatriation unfolded, both for museums and tribes in recent decades? What are its effects to communities and to the people who do the work? And most basically, why does repatriation matter? The modern museum is predicated on the collection of wondrous and strange, exotic, everyday, mundane objects that cultures have made all around the world at different times and places. And most of these items have been collected in ways that are entirely legitimate. You know, they're purchased, they're sold, they're traded, they're donated. And most of these items help us understand the world around us, where we come from, who we are, different cultures. There was a reason why Indiana Jones always says that belongs in a museum. This sentence, this idea, has really come to define the Western ideals of possession and curation of the world's heritage. And as we'll hear about, although archaeology has at times a fraught history, especially around the collection of human remains, the science of archaeology has so much to teach us about the past. We can learn so much from studying the human body. We can learn about gender roles in the past, migration patterns, religious beliefs, and so much more. And museums, while they also, in a way, can be conflicted institutions, are of such deep value to our societies. They help preserve the world's cultures. They build communities. They foster our identities and who we are. So all of this is to say is that both as an archaeologist and a curator, I recognize the deep values of both science and museums. But we must also recognize the tangled histories of these fields, the ways in which sometimes some items have been collected in ways that items were taken without community's consent. Maybe items were taken in ways that violated cultural traditions. And sometimes some objects were even stolen. So, with some examples, let me introduce you to Stuart Hewlin. So Stuart Hewlin, more than a century ago, was among the world's most preeminent anthropologists. He got his start at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was a curator at a museum there. And in 1903, he was hired as a curator at a new museum in New York called the Brooklyn Museum. And the Brooklyn Museum, as a new museum, had the thing that curators hate most, which is empty shelves. So Hewlin looked around and he said, where can I go to collect the most number of things as quickly as possible? And he settled on the Pueblo of Zuni in New Mexico. So he took a train out west with thousands of dollars in his pockets, and he started buying up pretty much everything he could. And he discovered that the Zuni, in fact, were willing to sell him just about everything. In fact, Zuni later joked that they were lucky after Hewlin left that they still had their underwear. He literally was just collecting every single thing he could get their hands on. So we might ask, why? Why were the Zuni collecting, or why were the Zuni selling almost everything they possess? Well, the reason is, as Hewlin himself noted in his notebooks, the Zunis were close to starving. They were farmers, desert farmers, and there had been a couple years of droughts. And in years past, they used to be able to go out into the surrounding areas to hunt and gather, but because of encroaching settlers, they were no longer able to do that. Additionally, just several years before Hewlin arrived, there had been a smallpox epidemic. And it had wiped out 20% of the tribe in a single year. Imagine that. Imagine just 20% of the room just gone. Evaporated, right? It threw the society into chaos. And the people were starving. And so they sold what they could to make what money they could. And yet, in their desperation, the Zunis would not sell Hewlin the things he wanted most: religious objects. At the time, anthropologists thought that religious objects would provide totally unique insights into human cultures, and so they really wanted religious objects. But the Zunis believed that religious objects needed to stay on the reservation in their place of origin. One thing that Hewlin wanted most was an object that's known in the Zuni language as the Ahayuda. And I'm using this image here with permission of the Zuni tribe. The Ahayuda, as you see two of them standing here, they're usually about waist high, about 2-3 feet high, carved out of wood. And every year, Zuni priests make new ones. They do this in an elaborate ceremony where they believe that these wood sculptures are literally brought to life. Zunis talk to the Ahayuda as they would to a child or an adult. Zunis then take these Ahayuda, two of them that are carved every year, and place them on a shrine where they are supposed to, throughout the year, protect the Zuni people and keep the universe in balance. At the end of the year, a new cycle begins. Two new Ahayuda are carved, and as you can see on this shrine, all of the previous year's Ahayuda are laid to rest, where they are to retire, their power seeping back into the earth as they naturally degrade. Well, Hewlin made clear that he really wanted Ahayuda for his museum. And when the Zuni leaders learned about this, they even sent around their sentries, their guards around the Pueblo, saying that if anyone was caught selling the Ahayuda, that they would be executed, that they would pay the ultimate price for selling the tribe's gods. Yet nonetheless, in the desperation of some Zunis, Hewlin was able to possess 12 Ahayuda that were sold to him. As soon as he got them, in the middle of the night, literally, he rushed them out of the Pueblo and sent them back east. It wasn't just sacred objects that museum curators took without a concern for the humanity of the native communities they were studying. It was also common for curators of this time to collect human remains. Here's an example from a letter from a U.S. Army surgeon in 1869 in Kansas, where there was a battle with Pawnee. And even just right after the battle, the surgeon was attempting to decapitate the soldiers and take their heads and send them back east to what was then called the U.S. Army Medical Museum. That kind of collecting wasn't at all haphazard, but was ordered. That motivation cascaded down from the highest levels of the U.S. government. In 1868, the U.S. Surgeon General sent out an order to all Army officers in Indian country to collect human remains. And they were to collect Native American human remains however they could. And they were doing this because they believed that the human body had a lot to teach us about the progression of different cultures, of different ethnic groups, and that at this time it was believed that you could even determine things like personality from the shape of the skull and the kinds of bumps you had on the skull. And so archaeologists and anthropologists were determined to collect Native American human remains. And so the point here is that the collecting of Native American bodies, stockpiling them for science, became a federal policy. This kind of collecting also happened at Sand Creek. In addition to the scalps and other body parts that had been taken, through the years, people returned to Sand Creek and took the remains of the victims there. Because after the massacre, the families, the people who survived, were never able to return back to the massacre grounds to rebury their dead. And so strewn across the massacre site were human remains. And we know from, for example, a recently discovered notebook by a lieutenant who was escorting General Tecumseh Sherman across the American West, that General Sherman collected 5 skulls from Sand Creek. These eventually went to the U.S. Army Medical Museum, and in 1900, these were transferred to the Smithsonian, America's Attic. And whatever happened to those other body parts that were taken during the massacre? Well, most will never know. They've really been lost in the fog of history. But we do know the stories of a few. We know, for example, of one scalp that was taken by Corporal William B. Jacobs. And Jacobs was at the massacre, participated in it, took what he thought was the scalp, a long section of hair, from an Arapaho chief. Jacobs mustered out of service. He ended up trading the scalp that he possessed to a collector. The collector ended up passing on, and his heirs sold it to a museum in Florida. The museum in Florida ended up donating their entire collection, including the scalp, to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where I worked in 1968. And so this gives you a sense not just of where one scalp ended up, but also the kinds of transformations that are involved as an object moves from one context to the next, how it goes from, a person to a war trophy, to a curiosity, to an artifact. So when did Native peoples begin to get back their ancestral remains and sacred objects? Well, this happened in many ways, in many places, but one key story involves this woman, Rhea Pearson. The story goes that one night in 1970, she was at home cooking dinner for her husband, John, who worked for the Iowa Department of Transportation. And a normal night, he comes home and he interrupts her preparing dinner, and he says, "Honey, I have something to tell you, and I don't think you're gonna like it." What happened? She wanted to know, of course. He said, "Well, we're constructing, this new highway outside of town, and we came across an old cemetery. So the archaeologists were called out. There are 27 graves. The archaeologists dug all of them. Based on how the graves were shaped and what was in them, they determined that 26 of those graves belonged to Anglo settlers. And so those individuals were boxed up and taken to the cemetery that's now being used in town and immediately reburied. The 27th individual, though, she was determined to be Native American, likely Potawatomi. She was boxed up, and instead of going to the cemetery, she was sent to the office of the state archaeologist in Iowa City. So these 27 graves, all in the same exact place, disturbed in the same way, with this highway coming through, all buried in more or less the same period of time in the 1800s. This woman, the only reason she was treated any differently from those other 26 people was because the archaeologists determined that she was Native American. Well, Rhea Pearson was also known as running moccasins. she was Yankton Sioux. At the time, she was 38 years old, a mother of 6. She wasn't a political activist. She wasn't involved in politics at all. But she knew to her bones that this was an injustice. So the next morning, she sent her husband to work and her kids off to school, and she dressed in her traditional regalia, as you see here, and she drove 90 miles to the state capitol. And she basically forced her way into the governor's office. Even then, it wasn't very easy to get into the governor's office. And she forced her way in, and she single-handedly convinced the governor of the injustice of this. Because what's really important to understand is what the archaeologists did in that moment was not nefarious. They weren't trying to mistreat Native American people or ancestors. They were actually following the law. Because Iowa law said at the time, as almost all state laws said at the time, that Indian burials, Native American burials, were archaeological resources for the state. So what needed to change wasn't just attitudes or perspectives about the treatment of Native peoples. What needed to change was the law itself. And so Maria Pearson worked with the governor, Robert E. Ray, and in 1975, Iowa became the first state that gave equal rights to Native Americans, not only in life, but also in death. So in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, there began a really raging debate between Native Americans and their allies on one side, and typically scientists, museums, and archaeologists on the other side. And there were many different arguments levied back and forth, lobbed back and forth, but I want to identify just a few of the key ones to give you a sense of how this debate played out. On the one hand, you had Native peoples and their allies saying that archaeologists were essentially colonialists, meaning that they were extracting resources that didn't belong to them and then using them for their own purposes, for publications and museums and those sorts of things. On the other hand, you had museums and archaeologists defending what they were doing, saying that they were actually preserving a culture that too often would otherwise be destroyed. Think about even those archaeologists in Iowa, right? That if they weren't called out when that highway went through that cemetery, who else would have protected those graves? Another argument was that by removing sacred objects from religious practices, by removing ancestors from traditional lands, museums were undermining the religious freedoms of Native peoples. On the other side, you had scientists saying that if you take away the things that we study, then you are threatening our freedom of speech. Another argument that Native peoples spoke to was they said that the removal of their ancestors, especially from their graves, caused all kinds of harms in their communities, whether it was environmental harms or alcoholism, abuse. They said that the disruption of their ancestors, the disruption of their culture was contributing to the disintegration of their cultural traditions. On the other hand, you had scientists say that all we're doing is studying ancient people. How can this possibly cause any harms? So that gives you a sense, I hope, of how these arguments went back and forth. And even though there were people on the two extremes, there were people all throughout this debate in the middle trying to find common ground. Two of those people were Robert McCormick Adams, here on your left, who in the 1980s was the Secretary of the Smithsonian, and Suzanne Schoen Harjo. She at the time was the Executive Director of the National Congress of the American Indian, then and still the country's largest pan-Indian organization. And she's of Muskogee and Cheyenne descent. And the two of them had been working on trying to bring a really large collection of almost 1 million artifacts under the government's control. But Harjo and other leaders only wanted to do this if they could have provisions for repatriation. So they had been negotiating back and forth, and they were both going to be in Santa Fe in the summer of 1989. And Adams proposed to Harjo that they meet at a place called the Coyote Cafe. So Harjo agreed. And the story goes is that on the plane ride to New Mexico, she was looking over the documentation of what was in this collection, and also what was held currently in the Smithsonian. And it was there on that trip, on that plane ride, that she realized that the Smithsonian held those 5 skulls that General Sherman had taken in 1868. And these were the human remains taken from one of the worst massacres perpetrated against Native peoples in the 19th century. And even more, these were her own ancestors. Her own ancestors, the Cheyenne people, had survived the Sand Creek Massacre. So she got off the plane, gets to her hotel room, picks up the phone, calls Adam, and says, "As long as the Smithsonian holds my ancestors, there is nothing to talk about." Slams down the phone. Adams calls her back a few minutes later and apologizes. And he says that he didn't realize the Smithsonian held the victims from Sand Creek. And so he had agreed to all of her final requests for the collection to come to the Smithsonian, which would include provisions for repatriation. So in 1989, U.S. Congress passed the National Museum of American Indian Act, which created a new museum on the U.S. Mall in D.C. dedicated to Native peoples, but also included repatriation provisions for the Smithsonian. And with that law, archaeologists and museum professionals were totally panicked. They were sure that this law that pertained just to the Smithsonian would now be a kind of precedent for a law for all museum collections across the United States. So archaeological societies hired lobbyists. The museum director where I work at, although I didn't work there at the time, talked about stonewalling strategy with other museums. They're basically doing everything they could to try to put off a kind of law that would require them to pursue repatriations. But in the end, the tide had really turned. And on November 16, 1990, U.S. Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, as it's called. And NAGPRA is a really complex law, does lots of different things, but most fundamentally, it creates a process where federally recognized tribes can try to reclaim their ancestral remains, as well as sacred objects, funerary objects, and communally owned objects. And this law, although imperfect, has led to many repatriations. To date, somewhere around 59,000 skeletons have now been returned, 1.9 million grave goods, and about 15,000 sacred and communally owned objects. Included in these repatriations is the scalp from the Denver Museum, where I work, to the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, where there is a special area set aside for those massacre victims to be returned. The law has also afforded the repatriation of the Ahayuda. The Zunis actually started to try to reclaim those sacred figures, those statues, in the late 1970s. And before NAGPRA, they got about 24% of the known ones back in the United States. After the law, 100% of them have now come back home. And this is a list of just some of the many museums that have returned Ahayuda, including the Brooklyn Museum, as you can see here, returning all the Ahayuda that they possess. But as I mentioned, NAGPRA has certain kinds of limits. And one of the limits is that it provides no mechanisms for tribes to reclaim ancestors or sacred objects outside the United States. In 2014, I traveled to Europe with Octavia Stautua, a Zuni religious leader, to try to visit museums that today hold Ahayuda and have yet to give them back. We went to Germany and the Netherlands and France and England. There's probably about 8 or 9 Ahayuda in Europe. And because there's no law, because there's no international treaty for repatriation of these kinds of items, all Octavius can do is go to the museum staff, explain the importance of the Ahayuda, and politely ask for them back. And so far, none of those museums have returned any Ahayuda to the Zuni people. So in conclusion, let's return to that question we began with. Why does repatriation matter? I'd like to suggest it matters for at least 3 key reasons. First, museums long thought that they were preserving cultures by preserving objects. The idea was that if you took, a beautiful vase or an ayuda, or even human remains, that in a sense, you were preserving the culture itself. And one thing repatriation has taught us is that yes, preserving objects is important, protecting ancestors is important, but just as important are the living cultures that surround these objects, where these objects come from. And sometimes by returning those objects, you are actually doing more of a service to preserve the culture itself instead of just the artifacts that are produced by that culture. A Zuni colleague of mine has talked too about how repatriation has turned museums into what he calls mediating spaces. And what he's referring to here is that there aren't that many places left in American society where people come and they confront really hard questions about history, where they confront really hard ethical questions. And of course, the university is one great place where this happens, but there aren't too many others. And museums, these places of heritage and culture and community, are becoming those very spaces where we are confronting both the worst and the best of our past. Finally, museums have long operated on the notion that people like myself, a curator with a PhD, had a kind of absolute authority to dictate how a museum worked, how cultures were preserved in them. What repatriation is doing is really productively reshaping and shifting the power dynamics of museums and the heritage industry more broadly. So instead of it being just people like me having to make kind of top-down singular choices, we now work directly with descendant communities. The communities themselves have a say in the protection and preservation of their own heritage. It's a much more inclusive approach, and it's a much more effective approach in how cultures can be shared with broader publics. And so in conclusion, I'd like to end where I began the talk, at the Sand Creek Massacre. And this is the bench that overlooks the reburial area at Sand Creek. And not long into this project, I went and I visited the massacre site, and I sat on that bench. And the words that kept coming to me as I sat there were the words of a Cheyenne elder named Lawrence Hart. He said, "How do you heal a wound of the soul?" Speaking to the Sand Creek Massacre. What he meant was that this was such a horrendous, horrible event in the history of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. How could their collective soul ever be healed? And so one question that I often asked in my research as I did the work for this book, and I went to Alaska and Florida and Oklahoma and New Mexico, and I spoke with Native elders, I would ask them, does repatriation heal? Does NAGPRA heal? And the most important answer that I got came from another Cheyenne chief in talking about the Sand Creek Massacre, as well as all the other thousands of human remains that the Cheyenne have now retrieved from museums across the United States. And his name was Joe Big Medicine, and we were having a cup of coffee at a local diner. And so I asked him, Joe, does NAGPRA heal? And he looked at me, thought about it, wiped his mustache, and said, no, NAGPRA doesn't heal. And I was like so crestfallen because I'd done all this work. By that point it's almost like a decade of doing repatriation work, and I was so sure that this work was leading to some form of healing for these community members. And then Joe added, NAGPRA, that's just like the right thing to do. You're just showing honor and respect to your ancestors, to those victims at Sand Creek. But the process of repatriation, now that heals. He then went on to speak about how repatriation is part of a much larger movement for many Native peoples, including the Cheyenne. He talked about how in 2014, Colorado's governor offered the first apology, the first official apology to the Cheyenne-Arapaho people for the state's role in the Sand Creek Massacre. He talked about the spiritual healing run that the Cheyenne and Arapaho do every year. They start at the Sand Creek Massacre site and run 177 miles over the course of a week, and ending up in the state Capitol building in Denver to honor and commemorate their ancestors. He talked about the effort of the Cheyenne to try to enter into a dialogue with the town that's nearest to the massacre site. It's called Lamar, and their high school mascot was called the Savages. And the Cheyenne tried to enter into a dialogue with the towns and the high school to talk about what this mascot means to them, how it impacts them, and their sense of history and identity. And so it's all of these efforts together that lead towards healing. And what I think Joe Big Medicine was trying to teach me was that, yes, perhaps repatriation heals, but it's a particular kind of healing. You know, you have sometimes cuts that fade away and you never know they were there. Well, NAGPRA and perhaps many of these other things that Native peoples have to deal with, maybe they're more like scars. And scars are a particular form of healing, because even though the pain is gone, it shows and it proves that you survived something bad. And so in the end, I believe that repatriation helps Native people and perhaps helps all of us to endure. Thank you very much.